Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to take a look at an introduction to CSS or cascading style sheets. In this video, we're going to focus mainly on the background and a little bit of syntax as it relates to CSS. We'll be spending more time in later videos looking at the details of CSS, including where you would place your style. This video is part of a larger series of videos that focuses on HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and other technologies related to intranet and internet development. And this video assumes that you've watched some of the earlier videos on some of the HTML tags. So to begin with, what is CSS? Well, it stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and as the name implies, it is focused on the presentation and styling of the document. Now, in the earlier videos, we were talking about HTML and even XML, focusing on the structure of the document. In other words, a combination of the data and the metadata associated with the tags gives you the structure of the document or the relationship between the elements. A good example of that might be, for instance, the relationship between a table, the table head, the body, the foot, and then within the body, the individual rows and the columns. In other words, the language of HTML gives you the structure of the data, whereas the cascading style sheets then focuses on the presentation of that table. Now, we sort of blurred the lines in some of our examples. We actually introduced a little bit of style in a couple of examples for the purposes of cleaning up some of our earlier examples. However, the goal here with the cascading style sheets is that all of the presentation and styling of the document resides elsewhere in a separate file or in a separate location in the file, and so that the HTML can be focused solely on the structure of the data or the structure of the page. So what is CSS focused on? Well, it enables the separation of content and presentation. And what am I referring to when I'm talking about the presentation? Things like the layout. For instance, if you're sitting at home on your desktop computer, you might have a nice wide aspect ratio monitor versus working off of a tablet or off of your phone. And so you may want to present the same web page in two different views. Now, again, that's just an example of one use of style sheets. Another use of a style sheet for the layout might be that you don't necessarily want to change the content of your page, just where it is found on the page and the orientation between each of the elements. Another good example is the color related to things like the background, the borders, the fonts, the color of the font, the style of the font. In an earlier video, when we were looking at the various tags that could be associated with fonts, we mentioned that you can use the H1 to H6 tags for the purposes of sort of giving your document the feel of having a header and subheadings and so on. However, though, from an aesthetic perspective, that wasn't the real purpose. That was more for the structural nature of your document. Instead, what you would do is you would use cascading style sheets or style in general to perhaps give the font a different feel for each of your headings, each of your secondary headings, and so on. And that can be anything from color, it can be the type of font, the size of font, and so on. And it turns out there's many, many, many other examples of style that we're going to take a look at in our later videos. So what's the end result? You can have the same structure, but you can have multiple different presentations or views, whether it is different between your desktop monitor or your tablet or phone, or perhaps you simply want to make your website have a more refreshed look by changing the theme or the color. And again, there's some benefits to separating out the metadata and the data or the structure of the document with the presentation or the aesthetics. And again, we'll get plenty of opportunity to look at some examples of this. So how long has CSS been around? Well, it's been around since about 1996. It's considered one of the main components of internet and internet development. with CSS3 and moving forward, there isn't going to be this big one monolithic version change. It's much more modular. In other words, there's individual components of being updated and some improvements just in general on the styling and some increased functionality still being maintained by the World Wide Web Consortium. And I have provided for you some links at the end of this document and also in the description of the video. Now, where will you find it? Well, it turns out there's several places that you can find style, one of which we've already seen in some of our earlier videos, and that is just simply by putting it in line with an HTML tag or element. Now, there are some advantages and disadvantages to this approach. The main advantage is, particularly when you're doing quick development work, that you can simply include the style near or in the element in which you are interested in modifying. It's great for prototyping, great for throwing something together pretty quick. However, though, it is not really long-term sustainable, and we'll see in some examples why. And basically, it just leads to a lot of additional changes that need to be made and really sort of violates that separation between the model and the presentation, or the data and the metadata and the presentation. Again, not trying to discourage you from using it, just use it with caution. In other words, use it for simple sites. Best example of what we've already seen is where we can change the border for a table by affecting the style attribute. Second place that you're going to find it is in the document, in the HTML document, at the top of the HTML document by using the style tag. And you can see here in this simple example here that basically what I've done is I've included the style tags, the open and close tags that you would otherwise see in an HTML document. And inside that, you'll have the H1 tag as an identifier, meaning that if you have an H1 tag in your HTML document, the color of it will simply become blue. And again, this is a simple way of going about doing it. The style tags can reside at the top of the document or in multiple places throughout the document. There really isn't much of a limitation there, except for, again, it sort of violates that separation of the data and metadata from the presentation. A little harder to maintain, still perhaps better than the inline documentation. The advantage, though, either way, is that you can have some quick adjustment, quick changes, quick improvisation for the purpose of trying something out. And then ultimately what we're going to get to is going to be having it in a separate document with a .css file extension. And we simply link from the HTML file to the sample, in this case, sample.css file, and all of the styling for the document is simply found in the .css file. You can also have multiple .css files. The big advantage with this approach is that you can change the .css file and then not have to change the .html file. In other words, any changes that are made, for instance, you might want to change the color for an H1 heading to red from blue. You simply change the contents of the .css file, and the next time the page is loaded, it will get the new H1 coloration. The other distinct advantage of putting it into a separate file is that you can share that .css file across multiple .html pages. That ends up being the much more long-term sustainable solution. And again, we're going to explore all three options in our later videos. So what about the syntax? Well, it does vary a little depending on whether you're inline versus document, but in general, it's comprised of a property value pair separated by a colon and then delimited by a semicolon. The properties are specified in the CSS standard. We'll take a look in just a little bit, a reference for that. But in general, the values may be keywords, such as things like center or inherit, numerical values, depending on the type of property that you are attempting to modify. For instance, the number of pixels in an image. We have actually already seen something similar to this earlier when we were looking at our images, or the percent, 80% in this case, when you're looking at the relative size of an element compared to its parent. The other distinct advantage with CSS is that we can group the behavior. meaning that in the earlier example on the previous slide, if we go back one slide, you'll see that I was referring to a single element when I was talking about the border double. In this case, I was talking about a table border. In other words, basically, anytime we had to add a table to our page, we would need to include the style element. That's, of course, one option, or rather the style attribute. The second option is, of course, that we reference a tag, in this case, an H1 tag. Both of these are relatively limited in their impact. However, there is another option. We can, of course, do things by element, much like we saw in the earlier example, or we can do it by ID. So regardless of where the element is in the page, then you simply have the style associated with the ID. Again, don't worry, we'll get a chance to go through some examples in later videos. And then another way of going about doing this is also by class. In other words, you can have a class associated with a group of elements. For instance, if you're looking at all of the odd or even elements in a table, or the odd or even row elements in a table, you simply identify them by different classes, and then you can style them according to their class name. So again, you'll notice different syntax. There is the pound sign in front of whatever the ID is to indicate that you're looking for an ID, and then a period in front of the class name if you're indicating a class of elements. And again, we'll get an opportunity to look at this in just a little bit in depth. And then, of course, there are ways to also do this relative location in the document tree. Again, that's a little more sophisticated. It'll take us a little while to get to those examples. But to give you a little bit of a summary, I have provided this link here for the CSS priority scheme. Give me 1 second here, and we can go to that link. Give it just a second while that page pulls up. And you can see here, again, this is sort of a hierarchy, if you would, of the behavior. All the way down at the bottom, the lowest priority is whatever browser default value is determined by W3C initial value specifications. A great example of that would be the behavior of the H1 through H6 tags. And then you can see here, you can actually emphasize if you have the important annotation overwrites any previous priority types. So again, you've got a couple of different options, including the inline. You'll notice here that the inline takes pretty high priority, even over a import or a linked document. So lastly, when we go back to our PowerPoint slide, I wanted to provide you with some links here, some references. I'm not going to go through these in this video. Let me give these to you. The idea here is that you'll go through and bookmark some of these. One of them is from the W3C, the consortium. W3Schools, of course, much like with our HTML, JavaScript, and other technologies, is going to be one source that we can use, recognizing that it does have some limitations. However, there is one link, though, that I would encourage you to go ahead and bookmark, and that is the W3Schools CSS Reference. And so if you take a look, it gives you all of the different CSS properties in alphabetical order. Now keep in mind, much like the attributes in the HTML elements, they do not all apply to every element. So in other words, this is all of the possible, excuse me, these are all of the possible CSS attributes, and we'll need to go through and figure out exactly which ones are going to be relevant to which HTML tags. Likewise, you'll see that there is also the CSS selectors reference. This is also a useful document to at least look up. This is where we were talking about an individual element, a ID, and then also a class. And you'll see that there's a number of different ways that you can access CSS attribute selectors, nesting, and so on. So again, we've got a couple of different things that we'll want to take a look at. And then lastly, you'll see that there is a Wikibook interesting resource you might want to take a look at. Again, just another example, another way of looking at things. But I wanted to provide you with these links so that you'll have sort of a good coverage. There's, of course, Mozilla documentation as well. So without further ado, let's end this video here, and we'll then start taking a look at various examples of style sheets, starting with the inline style, moving through to the document level, or rather the tag level that's internal to the document. And then lastly, we'll take a look at separate style sheets or external referenced style sheets. So as always, hopefully you found this video useful. If you've got any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out. And thank you for watching.